Hi friends. Why did it take God so long to reveal that he's three persons in one God, right? I mean, we know from the Old Testament that there's hidden nuggets of that that only come to light through the prism of the New Testament. So we see that all that is in the New Testament is actually there, buried in the Old Testament, and it takes the Old Testament, the time of Jesus, to bring all that to light. So yeah, we know that. But why is it that God reveals to his people Israel that he's one God? Why doesn't, when he reveals himself as one God, he doesn't also simultaneously say, I'm three persons in one God? And here's the bottom line, because they would be confused by this. And they would think that there's actually three gods and worship three separate gods. And that would be a disaster for us as human persons, as individuals, as people in relationship with one another, and as people in relationship with God. And here's the reason why. Because the Jews lived in an age, century after century, where they wanted to be like their neighbors. All the other countries, peoples, cultures of the ancient Near East, like the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Persians and the Romans and the Greeks, they all had their pantheon of gods. They had multiple gods. And the Jews wanted to be like them, so there were times that they were tempted to worship these other gods, just so they could be like other people and have everything that they have. Let's just speak plainly about this, right? They actually believed, like the Romans and the Greeks and the Persians, that these other gods existed, but they didn't exist. They were false gods. In fact, they were gods of their own making, that these other cultures made in the image and likeness of humanity, and for the purpose of controlling these gods in order to get what they wanted. They thought, well, if I want crops, I'll pray to the god of crops. If I want a baby, I'll pray to the fertility god. If I want to make war, I'll pray to the god of war, and so on and so forth, for every facet of their lives. And this was their puny effort to try to control something they can't control, God. And even ruin their own lives. We're not in control of our lives. Not in this world. Not in this occupied world, occupied by the enemy. We're not in control, But God is. But we don't control him. And that's exactly part of the falling of all these other religions that no longer exist anymore. None of them exist anymore, right? And the reason why they don't exist is because, of course, they were following false gods, but also the reasons why they were following those false gods. So if God would have said to the Jews, there's one God and the three persons in one God, then they would have gotten confused and they would have tried to worship three separate gods, but they're not. So God had to first work that out of them by a series of events throughout the history of Israel, like the wandering of 40 years in the desert, where time and time again, after leaving Egypt, a land of many gods, even though they left Egypt, they couldn't get Egypt out of them. And so God had to work to get the culture of Egypt out of them, and through a series of events taught them that they could depend upon God and God alone for like basics like food and water, let alone worship and love and devotion and life. And that's something of what those hard years of trial ended up being one of the greatest blessings for Israel, right? Well, after the Jews go through all that over centuries, they get to a point where they're pretty hard and steadfast that there's one God and one true God, and it's their God, it's Yahweh. So in the fullness of time, Jesus comes, and he not only comes to save us from all the false gods that we've made of this world, but it's time and we're ready to be able to hear that there are three persons in one God. Why is that so important for us as human beings? Well, here's the reason why. We're made in the image and likeness of God. That's the reason why. So we find our identity, we find the purpose and the meaning and the place of our relationships and our mission in this life, we find it from God. And God is a community of persons. And we are made in the image and likeness of God. So community and relationships should be very important to us. So Jesus reveals this to us. Listen, there's Father, there's Son, and there's Holy Spirit. And that's the way we need to live our lives as Christians. We need to place our lives and all of our stuff and all of our junk that we carry inside of us and we carry outside of us. We need to place all of that in the center of that triune relationship, that love relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But here's what we end up doing. We end up, first of all, like our Jewish forefathers and mothers, making gods out of everything else. But what's worse, what's sadder, is that we know these other things are not gods, but we worship them just like gods. So, for instance, we set our kids down at an early age at the altar of the TV and other devices, and we, by our own example and by just sitting them there so that we can do all the things we want to do, we sit them in front of these gods for hours every day. Is it any wonder that they're worshiping them? And we allow our kids to play these games on these devices for hours and hours every day. Certainly hours and hours when you accumulate them every week. Now, we make gods out of alcohol, out of pornography, out of sex, out of our jobs, out of other people and relationships, out of everything. We make gods that we worship. By worship, we mean that if there's one true God, and Israel learned this, then they learned to put God above everything else in this world. And they basically said to the world and themselves and the family and everybody else that I worship God and God alone. In fact, that was the prayer they prayed every 3 days. 3 times a day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is Lord alone. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And that's what God taught his people to do, so that they would do that. So that they would first love God with everything that they are. Then they will know how to love everyone else and love everything else. Not first, not greatest, not before, not usurping God, but behind God, or place all of those inside of God, so that we always have a right relationship from our relationship with God with everyone else and everything else in this world. But that's not what we do today. What we do is we take all these other things, we separate them from God, we set up altars to them, we make them into God, and we put them before God, and therefore we make them gods. We say, you're more worthy than God, because I'm giving more attention to you in any given week than I'm giving to God. I'm giving more of my heart, my mind, my soul, my behaviors, my hopes, my dreams, my fantasies. I'm giving more to all these other things, individually or cumulatively, than I am to God. And there's our gods. And the sad thing is we know they're not gods, but we act as if they are. And then these gods, as they did with Israel, lead us away from the one true God. We can make gods out of anything, like sports for our kids or for ourselves, right? And what do they end up doing? Taking our kids away from the worship of the one true God on a Sunday morning, right? And this is with everything in life. So it's important then that we understand the nature of who God is. And then in the fullness of time, Jesus reveals that nature of three persons in one God. Because that's how we are to live. As if, in fact, it is three persons in one God. And then we place ourselves in the middle of those three persons in one God, who are eternally connected and are eternally protecting us, inspiring us, enlightening us, leading us, filling us with their love, their identity, their nature, their mission, their purpose in this life. And then when we're in the center of God, God becomes the center of us. And then everything else is not the center of us, but everything else rotates around God and us rather than displacing and usurping God. And then everything else has its right place. We can enjoy a glass of wine. We can enjoy a Netflix series without binging on all 7 seasons in one weekend. We can enjoy a baseball game or our kids excelling in sports or doing well in academics as long as it doesn't usurp the place of God in their life or in our life. And it won't if we know that there are three persons in one God and we place ourselves in the center of that. Until next time, friends.